Despite only having 5 mainline entries, the Shin Megami Tensei series is one that has made a huge impact on the JRPG genre. With its innovative mechanics, dark atmosphere, and synonymous difficulty, it's garnered a loyal fanbase and also given rise to another juggernaut IP in the gaming space. So today, I thought I'd talk about one of its more forgotten or perhaps lower-key mainline entries, Shin Megami Tensei IV. But where do we start with Shin Megami Tensei IV? Well, before we talk about the game's systems, mechanics, presentation, or even its story, let's talk about how and when it came to be. From its inception, the SMT series has always been one that has struggled outside of Japan, with many of its earlier entries never seeing release in the West. What's more, while its third mainline entry, Nocturne, or Lucifer's Call if you grew up like me in merry old England, did see more push outside of Japan back in 2003, its soft initial sales numbers and mixed critical reception placed the series' mainline entries firmly on ice. A course of events that is generally now seen as unjustified, given Nocturne's cult status and eventual modern re-release, but that's a topic for another video. But just because there were no numbered SMT games coming out for the next little while, the series still continued to thrive in other iterations, with spin-offs like Strange Journey and of course the Persona series. However, 6 years after Nocturne, in 2009, developer Atlus decided it would heed the call from fans for a new mainline entry in the SMT series, and began what would be a 3.5-year development cycle that would produce Shin Megami Tensei IV. When Shin Megami Tensei IV finally saw release in 2013, it had been 10 years since the series' last entry. Nevertheless, when release day came, it would mark the most popular moment both critically and commercially in the history of the series' mainline entries, both inside and outside of Japan, a record that would eventually be broken by the 5th entry in the series 8 years later in 2021. But what about the game itself? Well, let's start with the story. I'm going to say up top, right from the game's opening, you know you're in for a wild ride here. Also, I'm only going to talk about the first 5 hours or so of the story, as I think the first big narrative moment is worth citing as a prelude to what the game has in store. But I don't want to spoil the entire game, as it's well worth going in with at least a little blindness. Of course, if you want to go in completely blind though, feel free to skip to this timecode to avoid any and all spoilers.
Finally made it. I was fighting damn hard when I waited for you to show up. You do remember me, right? That's right. I'm Walter. Whatever happens after this, you better not forget me. Because you and me are going to make a world where anything can be changed if you have the will.
So there's a lot to unpack here already. However, while it might just seem like surrealist nonsense, this is actually one of several dream sequences shared by the game's protagonist, Flynn, and the friends that will accompany him on his journey. Broadly speaking, the game takes place in 2 settings. The first is the Eastern Kingdom of Mikado, a feudal society that takes inspiration from both medieval Europe and samurai-era Japan. Headed by the church and basking in steep societal classism, the kingdom is literally a giant pyramid, Flynn wakes from his bizarre dream on the day he is to travel to Mikado Castle so that he may undergo the Rite, a test that is designed to see if someone is worthy of becoming a samurai. In this world, the samurai are an elite group of chosen soldiers who are tasked with both slaying and controlling demons, monsters that seemingly appear from the world below. Setting out with his, if I'm honest, overconfident friend Issachar, Flynn arrives in the castle town to a mixed reception from the locals. Making their way up to Mikado Castle, the two take the Rite, which seems to involve strapping on a futuristic gauntlet and seeing if its AI likes you or not. Despite his lifelong calling to be part of the Order, Issachar fails the Rite immediately and is dismissed, but Flynn passes with flying colours, being told that he has the gift of demon control and then being ordered to report immediately to the barracks to begin his samurai training. As Issachar leaves dejected, Flynn meets a few of the other successful candidates, namely the brash and confident Walter, the studious and kind-hearted Jonathan, the considered and stoic Isabeau, and the complete bellend Navarre. After receiving their gauntlets and being introduced to the advanced AI that dwells within them, the candidates begin training in what is essentially the game's tutorial dungeon, Naraku. Existing as the bridge between this world and the world below, Naraku is essentially a cave system containing many demons and hazards to overcome. After learning how to fight and recruit demons, Flynn and his friends begin to realise between training sessions that they all have been appearing in each other's dreams. After a few more trips to Naraku and a little more training, word starts to spread across the kingdom of a mysterious figure known as the Black Samurai. Apparently, whoever this person is, they've begun disseminating and propagating certain items and ideas across the population of the Kingdom of Mikado. These seem to include many staples of what we see in modern society, including, but not limited to, contemporary literature and even manga. What's worse, after reading them and discussing their ideas at gatherings named Sabbaths, normal folk from across Mikado are said to be turning into demons. After discovering that such influence has reached his home village, Flynn and his new comrades accompany the other samurais there to quell the unrest. After besting the demons, their influence over the town, and even a heavily corrupted Issachar, the recruits save many of the village's inhabitants, but fail to capture the Black Samurai, who invites Flynn to meet her in the world below. After returning to Mikado Castle, the abbot of the monastery, from which the Order of Samurai receives its orders, tasks the group with travelling past the deepest part of Naraku and into a place where samurai are traditionally forbidden from venturing, in order to find and capture the mysterious Black Samurai and put an end to her tyranny. Despite some concerns given the nature of their orders, the group venture down into the depths of Naraku, and what they find there, well, it's kind of crazy.
What is this?
There are stars below us.
It's lovely.
That's right. It seems that a post-apocalyptic, modern-day Tokyo has been sitting underneath the Kingdom of Mikado, beneath a huge dome of bedrock for an unknown amount of time, giving rise to both the demons in Naraku and the many legends of the world below. This is such an awesome idea, and is very well foreshadowed up to this point in the game. Right from the start, the introduction of futuristic tech and contemporary concepts give the whole game a really original tone. It sort of feels like a reverse isekai, where normally you have a story being told from the view of someone from a more familiar world who gets pulled into a fantasy setting. But this inverts that idea by having the story told from the perspective of those who live in the fantasy world, discovering a place more similar to the world that we live in today. Now, I'm going to leave it there for the story, as I think it's filled with some truly original ideas, concepts and elements, none of which I want to spoil. What I will say though is that while not everything lands, and while there is some cliche moments here and there, the story and the themes in SMT4 are worth experiencing for sure. Themes like religion, law, good, evil, friendship and betrayal are all used to great effect, and by the end of the game, you won't be sure that the decisions you made were the right ones, in the best possible way. So that's the story, but what about the presentation? Well, much like Nocturne sought to develop the series in new directions, Shin Megami Tensei IV also tries to do the somewhat difficult job of iterating on the formula, whilst also being hampered by the power limitations of the Nintendo 3DS. What this culminates in is a game that both looks great and straddles the old and the new eras of SMT. A good example of this is the fact that when you're dungeon crawling, the game is full 3D, just like it was in Nocturne, and even develops the moment-to-moment gameplay by having enemies now be visible and sometimes avoidable as you move around. You see, unlike its predecessors, now battles are not strictly random, but are instead initiated by interacting with polygonal figures that will appear and patrol the areas as you traverse them. If you run into one of these, or they run into you, they can get the drop on you, but if you attack them, then you will do a little bit of damage and attack first in battle. While we'll talk more about the battles in a little bit, it's worth noting here that once battle begins, the game switches to essentially a completely 2D presentation, with images of enemies and flat animated effects, much like the games in the series that came before Nocturne. This is the same with pretty much any in-game narrative sequences, which play out like a visual novel and include static animations, voice acting, and sound effects. Again, when comparing this to Nocturne, it definitely feels more like the game that came before it rather than an evolution, but luckily none of this is a bad thing, and actually, I love the way this game is presented, with every part feeling tailor-made for the 3DS. Voice acting is also great for the most part, and the soundtrack is filled with absolute bangers. More than any of this though, it's unsurprisingly an area which the whole series is known for, where Shin Megami Tensei IV's presentation really excels: its atmosphere. There is such a palpable difference between the bright but antiquated kingdom of Mikado and the dark, post-apocalyptic streets of underground Tokyo, its dilapidation just beginning to reach the terminal moment from which it will never recover. The desperation of the city dwellers, the eternal night created by the concrete sky, and the remnants of the world before are all just so awesome. Also, the little touches like the fact that you and your comrades and the people who live in Tokyo always struggle to understand each other due to the fact that you speak two versions of the same language that have both developed in different ways over many years in isolation. It's just all a testament to the level of immersion that can be created even in a handheld 3DS game. But let's get to the meat of the discussion here: the gameplay. As hinted earlier, SMT4 does take some tentative steps into new areas when compared to its predecessors, with mainly successful and occasionally unsuccessful results. As mentioned before, the physical appearance of enemies when dungeon crawling allows for more options, as the player can choose to try and avoid conflict, even if they'll often be unsuccessful. Also, the fact that you can attack enemies for an upper hand at the start of each encounter adds another wrinkle to proceedings. However, it is worth saying that the attack animation, camera angle, character and monster movements, and arc of your weapon swing does make this mechanic a lot harder to use than it should be, ensuring that you miss almost as often as you hit. Moreover, missing can land you in annoying situations, as it can allow the enemy to attack first and gain a big upper hand, thanks in no small part to some of the other systems that are in play here. So for anyone who's played either the Shin Megami Tensei series or the Persona series, a lot of what I'm going to talk about now will probably sound familiar. Combat is turn-based and also employs the press turn system. Icons at the top of the screen show both the player and the enemy turns. Just like in Nocturne, turn order per unit is dictated by their agility stat, but the player turn and the enemy turns are separate. If the player or the enemy scores a critical hit or exploits a weakness of their opponent, it will only use half their turn icon, allowing for another action in their turn of the battle. This means that with the correct strategy, the player or the enemy can score up to 8 actions in a single turn. On top of this is also the pass turn mechanic, which allows for the passing of a unit's turn to the next unit in the queue, a feature which can come in handy if you need a specific spell to exploit an enemy weakness. But all of this is pretty much the same as it was in Nocturne, and that's fine. After all, if it ain't broke. But there is one new element that has been unfortunately added to SMT4, and it kind of just makes everything worse. Okay, so whenever you or the enemy scores a critical hit and stroke or exploits a weakness, they have the chance to enter the smirk state in Shin Megami Tensei IV. While this state only lasts a turn and is removed if any status effect is applied to the unit in question, what it does is buff the enemy's attack, crit chance, defense, and resilience to elemental weaknesses. Now, that doesn't sound so bad, right? Well, unfortunately, the scale of these buffs is so ridiculous that it can swing entire encounters. And because whether smirk is applied or not is down in large part to RNG, it completely removes strategy from the equation and creates situations where you can win or more likely lose through no fault of your own. I have literally had several boss fights result in me being wiped because of this mechanic, only to reload and utterly annihilate the same boss with the same team at the same level. No extra grinding or swapping out demons. Just plain old chance was the difference between comfortable victory and complete annihilation. If we look behind the curtain for a moment and analyse the actual effects of smirk, it becomes clearer why this can be a little bit problematic on occasion. Once applied, smirk increases the unit's physical accuracy to 100%, meaning they can't miss, increases the critical rate of physical attacks to 95% and gun attacks to 70%, boosts the unit's evasion to 85%, and removes all of the unit's weaknesses. While it's never active for very long, having this level of buffs tied in any way to RNG is kinda crazy to me. Now, to be clear, I am probably making this sound a lot worse than it is, and it was not an issue that plagued the game constantly or even bothered me that much at all in my 45+ hour playthrough. Instead, I'd describe it more as an occasional annoyance, augmented by its position within an otherwise fantastic and proven battle system. On this score, I should probably take a second to talk about difficulty here. Shin Megami Tensei IV isn't a particularly difficult game, especially by the series' standards, and stands as one of the easier entry points for the most part. With that said, however, it still can be tough in places, and more importantly, it's a game designed to be played like a traditional, good old-fashioned JRPG, grinding and all. As long as you collect plenty of demons, utilise the fusion and skill mechanics, more on those in a sec, take time to explore and engage with the optional content, and fight every encounter you come across, you'll be fine. But please don't go in expecting no resistance on the game's default difficulty, because there will be some. In short, Shin Megami Tensei comes from a different era, and SMT4 maintains some of that DNA, meaning newer players who are more used to modern JRPGs, which tend to allow at least the golden path to be tackled with much less resistance, might run into a little trouble here and there. Luckily, if you do struggle, or you just want a more relaxed and less challenging experience, after dying twice, SMT4 unlocks an easier difficulty mode that can be toggled on and off at any time. So I mentioned the fusion and skill mechanics a second ago, and like the combat, both of these have seen some iteration in SMT4, with mixed results. Firstly, I think the skill mechanic is largely changed for the better, allowing for players to choose which skills their demons want to keep when evolving or fusing, and also allowing the demon to be able to teach skills to the protagonist. This really allows for a lot of customization in playstyle, and can help tailor your Flynn however you might want. When it comes to demon fusion, however, it seems like the developer was trying to streamline the system and make it easier for newcomers. Essentially, now the whole system works via a search mechanic, where you can fill out parameters like, for example, what demons you want to fuse. After doing this and searching, you're provided a list of potential fusions that you could make. On top of this, the game also provides a list of recommended fusions for you right off the bat, based on what demons you already have in your party. This is really a double-edged sword for me. For all the customization and granular control it removes, it does provide a much less overwhelming experience for those new to the franchise. So swings and roundabouts, I guess. Either way though, there's not too much extra work for those already familiar to get the demon they want, but having said that, it can still feel like you have a bit less control. Finally, on top of all of this, is the app system. Apps are unlockable buffs or enhancements that the player or the demons can purchase using app points, a spendable currency attained every time Flynn levels up. While some of these are a no-brainer, like extra skill and demon slots, many of the others provide a wide variety of options to tailor your progression in Shin Megami Tensei IV, and are also priced with balance in mind. This means that you're able to buy smaller incremental upgrades for less app points, or save and buy something more game-changing at your discretion. All in all, I really like this feature, and I found that it really helped me tailor my progression and the progression of my team throughout the game's runtime. The game will probably take you around 40 to 45 hours for a first run, unless you're trying to see and do everything, in which case it will be a lot longer. But before we wrap all this up, I do want to talk briefly about the moment-to-moment gameplay, and also the dungeons that are featured throughout SMT4. On the whole, the Shin Megami Tensei series has a reputation for featuring large, labyrinthine dungeons with varied biomes and art styles, especially since the series' third entry, which kind of solidified this. Now, while there are different aesthetics on show here across the variety of dungeons, they do fail to create as a distinct a personality as those seen in Nocturne. But more than that, the bigger change here is that none of them are particularly difficult to navigate, and feature almost no puzzles or difficult gauntlets to overcome. Layouts are much more basic and easier to traverse, and I didn't get stuck once in any of these dungeons. What this means is that the whole moment-to-moment gameplay here, especially when compared to Nocturne, is much less frustrating, but also less memorable, and fails to achieve the interesting nuance seen in its predecessor. And I guess that's kind of an analogue for Shin Megami Tensei IV as a whole, to be honest. Its changes and new quality of life features make it much more approachable for newcomers, and make the moment-to-moment gameplay much less frustrating, with the exception of that fucking smirk mechanic. But the byproduct of all of this is a much less interesting and memorable game overall. It still has the bonkers story ideas, dark atmosphere, and fantastic combat that the series is known for, and is still very much worth your time. But when all is said and done, it feels more like a great entry point for the series, rather than the apex of what it has to offer. Interestingly, Shin Megami Tensei IV did receive a sequel of sorts 3 years after its release, named Shin Megami Tensei IV Apocalypse. Now, despite owning this game, I'm familiar with it only via its reputation, and haven't actually gotten around to playing it yet. But despite not yet loading it up, I already know it is somewhat divisive, with plenty of defenders, haters, and ambivalent fans throughout the Shin Megami Tensei community. I'm thinking of playing it soon, so if you'd like to see how that goes, and maybe even watch some content on it, let me know in the comments below. And also, maybe sub and hit the bell so I can deliver such musings straight to your sub box. Anyway, that's enough from me for today. So till next time guys, as ever, stay safe out there.
Hey kid, don't ever let them get inside your head. They'll tell you what to do in life instead of everything you know that you could get. Don't let them guide your life towards regret. I'll fight for what I love with every breath. My past is filled with things I won't forget. I use them all to push me to my best. So treat the worst of times just like a test. If only I could go back in time, I'd tell myself